Hi, welcome back to CS170 fall session. So we are. We're covering chapter 20 this week. Your recitation is going to be covering JavaScript functions, which is what we covered in the lecture last week. So chapter 20 is split up between doing loops and arrays. So this first lecture I'm going to be doing is going to be covering loops. So let's get going. So here we are. So one thing, don't really know how useful this is, but there's the idea of using like a console here. So a lot of times you're running your HTML, JavaScript, and you have error. You're not sure what happened, right? A lot of you submitted your extra credit where your button doesn't work because your on-click event wasn't done properly. So for those of you that had some problems with that, you should go back and review the lecture or look at the many examples there are out there about doing an on-click event for the button to do an alert box or whatever. But you can do an error console here. So if I were here, let me see. Here. So I would go into this corner here and go to more tools. And then you can go into developer tools. And you'll have like this error console here. Or actually, I should say console. So if you're doing different things like displaying stuff, you could do like commands to actually display stuff to the console. So it kind of helps you to kind of trace like maybe some variables through your code and stuff like that. Like I said, at this level, for the beginner level, I'm not really sure how much you're really going to use console. So there will be some other stuff that maybe you can find a little bit more useful, especially for the shorter code that that you are writing. So let's cover some of that in a second. So one of the interesting things here is this JavaScript validator. Okay, and so this is like some sample JavaScript here. And then on the right hand, you can see there's like these validate code here, and there's some other stuff here to help you with your JavaScript code. On the right hand side, it will kind of highlight some issues for you, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. Okay, so this is called a validator. So you basically paste your JavaScript code in here, and it will help you to look for errors or issues. It doesn't catch all of them. Like if you have a logic error or something like that, you're not going to really see that in here. But for other errors, you'll see it. And like I said, I'll demonstrate that in a second. Now, the other thing is I use something like js.do, right? It's an online JavaScript editor. Again, you can see here, you type some stuff will pop up as error. So in this case, you can see like this alert here is missing an open paren, okay? And then it doesn't really give you that useful an error, right? It just kind of says there's a uncaught syntax error here. And then you kind of look at it and you can kind of almost spot right away the open paren issue, right? That's a very common issue where you have mismatched quotes, mismatched brackets, mismatched parentheses or whatever, right? And this is where if you do like something, let's say in the Notepad++, which you also see in some other editors too. So it's nothing unique to Notepad++. So if you click on certain things, let's say I click on this, I think I've showed this to you before in the past, you can see it will highlight the other things that are associated with it. So let's say I do this, you can see it does like this matching up of the brackets here. And obviously if you have an issue, you're not going to get the matching bracket, right? So things like this could be useful, like so, right? And I'm going to go to the other stuff in a second once I get through this a little bit, okay? Okay, so JavaScript editor in this case is just giving you an example of this code here with no syntax errors. Okay. But one thing to notice, some of you might have been trying to mess around with this a little bit in terms of your comparison operators, doing an and an or. So you have like these double bars here. That means or, right? So if either one of these are true, then this whole thing becomes a true, right? And then if this becomes a true, then it will go into here, right? So in this case, it's saying if Anna Katz is less than 0, or if Ellen Katz less than 0. If either one of those become true, then this whole thing becomes true, and it'll go into here, the alert for error. Else, it will go into here where total Katz equals Anna Katz plus Ellen Katz, right? And then it gives you the alert here for the total Katz. And then it's concatenating this value of total Katz onto this. So then it will print out total Katz equals to whatever number, okay? And then, I think we've talked about this several times. There's like a lot of good stuff in W3 schools. So you'll be able to go in there, look up almost any type of topic related to JavaScript, HTML, as well as there's YouTube instructional videos that go along with this. So you'll be able to go through that and pick up a lot of things if you have some questions. Like the W3 schools, they actually have things where you can try it yourself. You can see this here. So it's almost like having, well, not almost, it is having the editor right there. So you can have the editor, play around with it, and then run it all in one place. Okay. All right, so the idea of loops is this idea of iteration, right? So you go through in these loops over and over again. You're doing something kind of repetitive, right, for a certain amount of time. Maybe you want to go through, I don't know, like, every single person in the class to get their first name, last name, right? So you're going to do a loop for however many times, for however many students there are in the class, and ask for the next student to be input into the system, let's say. Okay. So these are the different topics here related to the arrays. Right. And this is just talking about the idea of playing something over and over again, right? You've probably seen this. You're playing your music, you want to play the same song over and over again. You can put it on repeat, right? So similar type of thing when we're doing our loops here. Okay, so I just basically took this code here. This is not a loop, but it kind of starts to, introduce you to the idea, right? So here we're doing something over and over again 3 times. Okay, and so what do we have to do to do something somewhat repetitive for a certain amount of time? So in this case, we want to do something 3 times. So we're actually keeping track with a counter, right? So this counter is saying less than or equal to y. In this case, y is 3. And we're starting the counter at 1, okay? So we do something here, then we increment it by 1, right? And that something is taking the answer times x, right? So the answer starts off at 1 and x is 4. So that means the first step here, answer is equal to 4, okay? Now we step to the next one. The counter has been incremented to 2, so it's still less than 3. And then it's going to take the answer equals the answer times x, which is 4 times 4 now, right? Because answer has been set to 4 here, okay? So this will become 4 times 4, and it goes to the next step where it will equal to 3, and just like so, right? Now, this is fine, it demonstrates it, but what happens if I change this to, I want to do this 5 times, right? That means I have to add a couple more lines of this, if I want to make this 20 times, then I have to add even more lines, right? So you can see how quickly it becomes pretty cumbersome, right? And so what I've done here, I just kind of set this up in HTML, and it's easy enough for you to type the same code, right? So I took the HTML, and remember, this is from the last week. We have this style, we set it to midnight blue. And just remember, here's your JavaScript. That means we're putting inside the script tags here. And just exactly the code you see on the PowerPoint there, that's what we have here, right? The only thing I did was I added the alert, right? To me, that's like a quick and dirty way to show, in this case, the answer, right? So I do this, and then I go over to here, and I run it, and the answer is 64. Okay, and then that's it, right? Nice and simple. Now, I did that just because I know we always tell you when you're turning in your assignments, you have to turn in the HTML file, and we'll give you like a template or whatever, right? Let's say we gave you this, and then you just have to put the script in, right? But I like to do this stuff in js.do or whatever, just because I can do something, I can get the results all in one place very quickly, right? So if you type in js.do in your browser, right away it comes up with these things, which are pretty useful, actually. It gives you like very quick little snippets of code that you can find useful here. So here, right, it does a hello world, right? And then here it does some like math calculation. Here for lesson 3 part, you can see it's doing a loop, right? So that's useful since that's what we're covering in classwork today, right? So you can see that as an example here. And you can see how this matches up with this stuff over here, right? And then you have like the little button here to generate a random number, right? So this actually covers a decent amount, if not all of the stuff that we've already covered in class. So it's a nice, useful little bit of snippet of code that you can use to learn and do your stuff here, right? So we have the math function, random, all right? So you can play around with this. You can make that number to whatever, right? So in this case, you remember like the random number goes between 0 and 1. You want to make it, you know, some other number. Let's say you want to do 10 random numbers, then you multiply it by 10, let's say, right? And then you need to round it to the integer. Maybe you do a floor on it or something like that, right? So you can play around with it. It's something that you probably want to know for the exam. We'll have some variation of generating a random number. Let's say a number from 1 to 100, right? How would you do that, right? Oh, actually, since I'm here, maybe I'll just do it here. So you can see it's doing that, right? So it's like 0.52, right? A number between 0 and 1. Let's do so I multiply by 100. So now what happens? Let's see. So now I shifted over 2 decimals. Now it's like 58 something, right? Let me see. Should be. Okay. Make it a smaller number here. Oops, I need to rerun this. Actually, let's make it it's like 3 or something. Okay, so you can see it's doing a floor, so it's actually going down to 0. You actually wanted to make it like a number 1 to 3 instead of like 0 to 2, like, so you just do a +1 here, okay? Okay, so you see how we're able to, even though the random number only goes like from 0 to 1, you can apply this type of formula to make it, let's say we actually do a generate a random number between 1 and 100, let's say, right? So you do something like this, okay? It's kind of shifted, right? Because if I did the floor, that means it kind of brings it down to a 0, right? And then in this case, if I did to 100, it'll be 0 to 99, right? So if you want to shift it back so it's really 1 to 100, then you just add 1 to it, okay? So something to keep in mind, you're probably going to see a question like this on the exam. So something you should know how to do, okay? Anyway, back to my original topic here. So I just basically pasted the code into here, which is fine. So I just run it and it says the answer is 64, right? But let me this out. And then I have a error here. Like I said, it doesn't really tell you that much useful, right? Except it got messed up here, right? But you can kind of look here and say, oh, I missed a parentheses here. And I fix it. Okay, now let's go back to the validator tool. So validator tool, this is the same thing. Let me zoom in here so you can see better. Okay, so same thing, right? And I validate the code, there's no errors, right? Let me do the same thing here. Okay, so came up with a little bit more errors than I would like. So it came up with all this stuff here. So that doesn't necessarily tell you that, you know, whatever the error is, right? But that's part of what a validator is doing right here. Let's see if I can get another error if I take this out. So this one looks a little bit better, right? So you have this unmatched open curly bracket, right? So it does tell you that it's on line 10. And it says there's no closed curly bracket, essentially, right? That's what it means when it says unmatched curly bracket. So then I put this back in here and you're good to go again. Okay, so that's what this type of things will do. And like I said, sometimes the error is not that useful. Maybe it gives you an idea where to look, but you still have to kind of know roughly what you're looking for. And this is where it might be useful to really build up your code like one line at a time, one or several lines at a time. Don't just try to type all your code in one big shot and then try to run it. And inevitably, you're going to have a bug in there somewhere and then try to figure it out from there. You're always better off by breaking it down to small chunks and do some prints in there and whatnot. Right. I know some of the students were talking to me about some issues that they had. They wrote the whole bit of code there. And then at the end, they wonder why the variable, the answer didn't come out correctly. But if you go through step by step, as you flow through the logic and put in different alert boxes along the way to print it out, you can usually figure out right away where there's an issue. You didn't assign the variable correctly. You didn't do your comparison operator correctly. Now we're learning loops. Maybe you didn't set up your loop properly. Okay, so just a suggestion that'll make your lives easier when you run into bugs and stuff like that. Right. So this is what loops are, right? So there's the idea of here. You initialize the loop, right? You start off at something, right? So in this case here, we start off the count at 1, right? And then you're going to do some sort of test, right? And if that test is false, you're going to stop. You're going to get out of the loop, right? And then if it's true, you're going to do something, right? And then once you do that something, you're going to increment it and you're going to make it the next number here. So in this case, if the count is less than or equal to 3, you're going to do the answer times x times 4, right? And then you're going to increment it, count equals to count plus 1, right? And that's how you increment it. So here, this is where they introduce this for loop here. So in this case, the for loop, the r equals to 1 is your initialization, right? You're setting r equals to 1. And then your test is r is less than 11. If r is less than 11, you're going to do the body of the loop, right? And then once you do the body of the loop, you're going to do r plus plus, which all that means is that you'll increment it by 1, okay? And that's like the basic initial loop that most people will learn, okay? There's more things you can do with this, but we'll go into that a little bit later, right? So, but this is the basic idea for loops here, okay? So this just kind of explains it in more formal terms here, right? So if you loop through this like 3 times, then you're basically saying you've gone through it in 3 iterations. Excuse me. So here's what the loops require, okay? Pay attention to this. You might want to write this down or, you know, note this or whatever. These are what loops require as far as we're concerned for this class. You need a control variable, okay? You need a test condition, right? You need the instructions to execute, and then you're going to update the control variable, and then you need a way to get out, right? That's exactly what all this was talking about here, right? So what's the control variable? That's R, okay? What's the test? It's R less than 11, okay? And then the instructions to execute is within this body of loop here, right? So you have your execute your statements here. And then you update the control variable. So this R++ is updating your control variable. And then you need a way to exit, right? And then you'll basically exit when you don't have R is less than 11. Okay, so when that's false, it'll come out and then it will stop here. Okay, so this is like basically doing the for loop, kind of explaining in the similar type of way, right? So here's your for loop. The first part here, notice the semicolon here, is where you initialize, right? You initialize your variable, you do your test here, you do your update here, and then you do your statements list here. And in this case, we're going to initialize j equals to 1. Your test is going to be j is less than or equal to 3. And then your increment of j will be either j++, or you can do j equals to j plus 1. And then you can do a statement list here. Okay, so note the semicolons and these things here. Now, I know you can actually, these are just 3 statements, right? You can actually put anything you want in here, right? For the sake of argument, let's say out here, you actually already set up j equals to 1 up here. You can put any arbitrary statement in here actually, okay? But let's just kind of keep it simple for this class, and let's just look at your for loop like this, okay? Right, and think of this idea generally, this is what you're gonna do, okay? All right, basically doing the same thing as what you just did here. Here's another for loop, right? In this case, you have your text is defined as what's between these double quotes here. Then you're gonna keep on concatenating drip onto it, right? So that's what this is, text equals to text plus drip, right? And you can do that 3 times, right? And then this is what it will look like, okay? This is short enough code. If you have some time, go ahead into your js.do and just try it, right? Just go in here, take out everything, and then just put in something like this, and very quickly you'll be able to get to this, okay? And then, like I said, for debugging or whatever, I usually like to do this alert here. So it just quick and dirty, just pops up whatever that variable is, okay? And then this is what you'll see. You'll see this here. All right, so you're going to see stuff like this, where here we initialize some variables, right? The number equals to 5, answer equal to 0. And then you keep on setting this answer to add a j to it every time you loop through it. And remember, j keeps on going up by 1 also. And then you'll have this alert here, okay? And then you'll see a 15 here. So what might you see on the exam? So for the exam, what you'll do is instead of having this alert here, we'll have something like, oh, what is what is the answer when, let's say, j equals to 3, okay? So it's kind of when j equals to 3, you kind of like halfway through like these iterations on the for loop, and you say, okay, j becomes 3, and then what is the answer when that happens? Okay, so it's kind of asking you to trace through the code, and you're going to show the answer. Okay, there will be different things where we talked about last week. We talked about global versus local variables. So if you have some local variable and you might have some global variable and they kind of mix and match those things together, then you kind of figure out what those values are at various points of when the code is running. As I mentioned before, j++ or j plus equals to 1 or j equals to j plus 1, all these are the same thing. Okay. Probably I wouldn't really do this in this class, right? Probably for this class, probably I would stick to this or stick to that. Okay, if you want to do this is fine. They all work. Just a reminder, they all increment j by 1. Okay. Now, I said before, like that for loop, that's like the basic thing that most people will start off with, but there's a lot of ways you can do this, right? So for one, you don't always have to initialize this variable to be 1. In this case, you can see we initialize it to -5, right? And then it's just doing j plus 1 until j is hitting something above 10. Okay. You could do this too, although I don't see this very often. But you can initialize it to like 3.5 and you can increment it in steps of 0.5. Okay. And then you can also increment by another number than 1. You can also decrement it by -1. Okay, but this is where you have to be careful, right? Because if you're counting down, you have to make sure you start off this number higher than what your test is, right? If you kept the test to be the same as something like this, you're going to probably have like a logic problem there. Okay. So this is just demonstrating the different ways you can do your iterations, right? You can step in different numbers here. And this is where if you do j equals to j plus 5, it's a little bit, you have a little bit more flexibility to play around with numbers if you want to change the step sizes versus j++. J++ is always going to increment by 1, and then that's it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, infinite loops are not good usually. So you can get into infinite loops where your test and your initialized variable just don't make sense, right? So in this case, it's testing where j is less than 3. Okay. So this one is actually okay, right? But this one right here, j is greater than 3. You start off with the j as 4, and then you keep on going up with it, right? So that means the next time it goes through, it'll be 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. There's no end to it, right? It will never stop because it will always be greater than 3. Okay. So this one is definitely going to be in trouble here. Okay. So, all right. Okay. Oh, actually, you know what? So I missed this one. Okay. Actually, this is incrementing I. So it's not even incrementing J. So I missed that one actually. Yeah, so this one's going to be infinite loop too. I missed the fact that this was, the test was on J, but I'm not even incrementing J here. I'm only incrementing I, okay? So that's a good one there, okay? So pay attention to this. These will both create like infinite loops here. All right, so you have some nested loops here, right? So in this case, you have one loop here, and then inside that loop, you're doing another one. And then you try that, you can try that out on your own. This is only like a couple lines of code here. So try that out on your own, and you can play around with different things with this. Just play around with these numbers a little bit. Okay, you can tell this is talking about minutes and seconds, right? So 60 seconds and a minute. So for every time you go through for each minute, you'll do 60 seconds, right? This one you should kind of pay attention to. Again, from an exam perspective, you're going to see some variation of this, right? So play around with this where you can play around with the numbers, play around with the steps, whatever, right? In this case, it's constant, right? You're just saying 10 by 10, right? So it's just going to do this 10 asterisk 10 times, okay? So that's pretty straightforward here. But here, you can see that it starts off with here where you're going to do 10 rows here. But in terms of the column is less than the row, right? So it's actually making the number columns variable. So at the beginning where your row is low, you're also going to have low columns too, right? And so you ultimately end up with something like this. So in your first row, you only have one column. Your second row, you have two columns. Third row, three columns, so on and so forth. And then you end up with this like little triangle here. Okay. So don't be surprised if you end up with something like this, right? Where on the exam, we might show you like this little triangle here and ask you to write the for loop or the nested for loop that's going to generate this triangle like this. Okay. This will be a fairly standard question that will probably come up. And then this is just inverted the other way. Okay, so in this case, they're starting off with the row is 10 and they're working their way down. So it's just totally the opposite of this one here. Okay, so they start off with the big number, that means you have big columns, right? So you have 10 rows, that means you have 10 your 10th row will have 10 columns and it works its way backwards, totally opposite of what we had here. Okay, so here's another simple array here. In this case, not another simple, this is an introduction to a simple array here. So you can think of an array as just basically like a bucket, a series of buckets that holds things, right? So in this case here, we're declaring an array, right? So we're doing a variable, we're calling it an array of people equals to new array, right? This is important here. New array, and then you're initializing all of the buckets into array with all these names of people. Okay, and then we're going to use this for loop to go through the array. Okay, people.length is like sort of like the math library, like math.random or something like that. The array has its functions too, and the array.length, right? In this case, people.length tells you how many of these buckets are in the array. Okay, so you're going to do a for loop where you start off at 0 and you loop through how many different buckets there are in the array. And then you do I++, and then you basically write out all of the names of the people in the array. You reference it with this I here. Okay, don't worry, I'm going to cut another lecture probably tomorrow to go into array. So this is just like a little taste of array. So this lecture is meant to cover more of the loops here. Okay. All right. So if there's any questions, let me know and have a good night.